Back in 1974, my dad wrote a little book, and he called it Memories of N.D. Baumberger. And in 1990, my stepmother wrote a little book about her life, and she called it Memories of the Past by Betty Doris Baumberger. And my kids got to tell me, you got to write the story of your life. So I started doing that quite a number of years ago, and I've got this written down, and I'm going to kind of stay pretty close to my script because I don't want to leave anything out. So some of it I'll just read off of what I have written. And I wrote this back prior to 1994. And I thought at that time that most of the things of consequence had already happened in my life. But I've got some more writing to do one of these days, and I'll have to get back to it. To begin with, I was born on a farm 1.5 miles south of Reno, Illinois, May 17, 1920. That was back in the days when babies were not born in hospitals, and doctors made trips to homes when needed. So I was born there at home. My father was Nathaniel Dresser Baumberger, and he was of Swiss ancestry, and my mother, Lola Inez Weber, and she was of German ancestry. And Craig wanted me to mention a couple of things that my dad had in the book of his memories, and that was the fact that he was born in a little town east of Ramsey by the name of Dresser. And that town is not there anymore. It was right along the railroad track. And my grandparents lived there when he was born, and they moved to the farm south of Reno when he was about 5 years old. The town of Dresser was named after my grandmother's father, Nathaniel Dresser. He owned a section of land in that area, and it was all fenced, and they could buy cattle from Texas and quarantine them on this big 640-acre pasture. And that's what they used it for, to buy feeder cattle and ship them in from Texas. Part of the farm where I was born was purchased by my great-great-grandfather, Rufus Dresser. He and his family and 7 children traveled from Chesterfield, Maine, in a covered wagon. And I've seen different accounts of their arrival in Bond County, but it must have been 1839 or earlier. And what a story he could have written if only he had recorded it. Kurt Baumberger, my nephew, now owns the farm where I was born, and he and his family now live there. In the past few years, he's remodeled that house. The house was built in 1914, and that was the year that my dad and mother were married. And he remodeled that house and kept the original house and kind of built onto it. And he was very particular about keeping the original house pretty much intact, and he did that. And they liked the results of it very well. He has some of the original land grants that were issued to the original owner of the land. And one of the barns, which was built somewhere around 1838, is still standing and is still usable. And he's done quite a bit of work on that barn and is still in good condition. Our first automobile that I can recall was a Model T Ford Coupe. And I don't know whether anybody knows what a coupe was anymore, but a Model T Ford Coupe was pretty small. It just had one seat, no back seat, and a little storage area on the back of it to store a few things in, plus a spare tire on the back. And that's what we started out with. And that's what we traveled around in until later, when our family reached 5 children and 2 adults, and the coupe wouldn't take care of us anymore. But one day when we still had that coupe, my finger was in the wrong place when the door was closed, and the end of my finger was pinched off and was just dangling by a small piece of skin. We just happened to be parked in front of the Dr. Carey's office in Donaldson. My parents rushed me inside. Dr. Carey calmly informed them that he could take care of that, and he proceeded to reattach the severed finger. Apparently the bone was not affected, and after it healed, it left only a very small scar. Christmas at our home was a joyous occasion. We always had a Christmas tree that was cut out of the woods, and we hung our 5 stockings from the mantel in front of the fireplace on Christmas Eve. We opened presents at breakfast, and then traveled across the road to grandfather and grandmother Fred and Winnie Baumberger's for Christmas dinner. And that was followed by opening a few more gifts there. And also gathered there would be the Uncle Willis and Aunt Bess Williford family. They had 5 girls, about our age, and Uncle Vern and Aunt Edna Redfern, and they had a son named Bill. One Christmas I recall that the snowdrifts were so deep that the Willifords could not get there by auto. So Uncle Willis and Aunt Bess milked the cows that morning by hand, no milking machines at that time. Then Uncle Willis hitched a team of horses to the box wagon. The family wrapped themselves in quilts and blankets to keep warm, and they traveled the 4 miles by horse and wagon and arrived in time for dinner. They had to leave in the early afternoon to get back home and milk the cows again at night. I have many fond memories of my early years. In the summertime, we spent many Sunday afternoons with our cousins, the George Weber family, and other young persons of the neighborhood swimming in Shoal Creek. These were the Depression years, and we didn't have fancy swimsuits, just old clothes, usually a pair of old overalls. And our favorite swimming hole was straight west of the crossroads in the Round Prairie neighborhood. And you go west from there almost to Big Shoal Creek. Then the road turns south and west again to the Oswald Ford on Shoal Creek. And if you don't know what a ford is, a ford was a shallow place in the creek, but didn't have any bridge to cross the creek, and then they crossed at these fords to get over to the other side. And that's what the Oswald Ford was, and it was shallow to get into the creek, and it was kind of a rocky bottom, but that's where we did a lot of our swimming. Then in the later 1930s, after the city park was built west of Greenville, our swimming activities took place there, where there was a sandy beach and a diving tower. About once a year, we traveled to St. Louis for a picnic with the St. Louis Weber family relatives. The Willie Kennedy family, he was in the stationery business. The Edna Goodenough family, he had a hardware store and a heating business. And Aunt Emma Weber, who had a hardware store on North Grand Avenue near the old water tower. And they came out to Reno to visit also about once a year. Uncle Willie Kennedy was our favorite because he always brought some scrap odd pieces of paper and cardboard from the store that they run for us, and he also brought some little small gifts, and he was always joking with us. And he always told us when we were little kids that he was afraid to come out to Reno because he was afraid to get run over by a streetcar. And back in those days, of course, they had streetcars in St. Louis. Reno was a rather busy little town during my boyhood days. There were 3 churches, 1 store, and for a while there were 2 stores, a blacksmith shop, a railroad station, and a post office, and a creamery. And I can remember when the creamery was still in operation. They accepted milk there at the creamery, and they made it into cream, and put the cream in small cans on the railroad and sent it to Litchfield, to the creamery up at Litchfield. I've got a postcard here that was mailed at the post office here at Reno in 1913, and it was written by my mother to Alpheus Gwynn, and it was an invitation to a holiday Christmas party that she and her brother were going to have in 1913. No post office there now. It's been gone for quite a number of years. Herman Hinke was an excellent blacksmith. During the busy season, the floor of his shop was covered with rows of plowshares that farmers had brought in to be sharpened, and some that were already sharpened waiting to be picked up. The store building is still standing, and you wouldn't believe that from looking at it now that it was a department store. The departments weren't very large, and they did not offer much variety, but there was a fairly good stock of groceries, some meat, candy, clothing, mostly work clothes, shoes, yard goods for making clothes, a little hardware, and they also sold feed for livestock. And there was a warehouse right south of where the store building is now, and that's where the feed was stored, in that building over there. It was just across the alley that went through there then. The post office was in the east part of the building, and there was a back room used for storage and a place to candle eggs. And I doubt if anybody now knows what candling eggs is. But it was a box with a light in it, and there were 2 holes in the front of it. You take 2 eggs, 1 in each hand, and you put them up in each one of those holes, and the light would shine through there and tell you whether the egg was good or not. So people brought eggs in there to sell, and they were always candled before they'd pay them for the eggs to be sure that they were good. We settled our accounts at the store once a month, and we also brought eggs in to sell, and we brought some chickens in to sell, and we hoped at the end of the month that we'd brought in enough chickens and eggs to pay the grocery bill. Sometimes it would, and sometimes it wouldn't. When I reached high school age, it was my job to check the addition on all the grocery tickets for the month for accuracy. Now, this wasn't a self-help grocery store. They had a clerk in there that went and got the things you wanted to off the shelf. And they got your ticket book out of the file and wrote down everything that you bought and what it was. And so you took a ticket home with you that listed all the groceries and the amount of money that you were charged each day. So at the end of the month, I got the job of adding all those things. I didn't have an adding machine either. I had to do that all by hand and see if our grocery bill is correct. Sometimes I'd find mistakes on it. Let's see, there was a store, a platform scale out east of the store building that was used to weigh wagons and trucks for farmers who brought in grain to be loaded in boxcars on the railroad siding. The railroad at that time was a two-track railroad, double-track railroad with a siding, and they would put cars on there. And in the early days, you brought the grain in sacks from the thrashing machine. So you pulled up and beside that railroad car, and you threw a sack up in the railroad car. Somebody carried it back in the back and dumped it, and then they brought the empty sack back. In later years, then they got a blower that they set up out there with a belt driven by a tractor, and they dumped those bags into the blower, and it blew it back to the back of the car. That saved quite a lot of the labor, but it was still a tough proposition. So that scale was there to serve that purpose, and also to weigh coal sold from the coal storage shed, which was out behind. There was also a small building used to store crates of old hens to be loaded on the poultry truck that came by about once a week and hauled the poultry into St. Louis to sell it. They also at one time bought pigeons and rabbits. My dad tells in his little book that he wrote about selling rabbits at the store up there. Traffic on the double-track railroad in those days was steam-powered. Mostly long trains carrying loaded coal cars pulled by a giant steam locomotive. There was also the local. It was a short train which stopped at all the small towns to deliver freight. There was a freight platform on the north side of the tracks just west of the depot that was there for passengers. There was also the passenger and mail train, which made a round trip each day except Sunday. It was a little steam train, a little steam engine with one or two cars. We called it Old Glory. I don't know where that name came from. Sometime in the 1930s, the railroad started using a little diesel-powered train, which we named the Puddle Jumper, and sometimes Tunerville Trolley. It wasn't very reliable and sometimes had to be towed on its route by Old Glory. There were also cattle pens and a loading ramp for loading and unloading livestock in railroad cars. And then they were located on the south side of the tracks, about 100 yards east of Reno. Use of this facility was discontinued when trucks began to be used for transporting cattle. But I can still remember when my dad and grandfather bought 2 carloads of cattle down at East St. Louis, and they'd put them on the siding at Reno, unload them in those pens, and drive them down the road to our farm, which is about a mile and a half south. And they'd feed those cattle over the winter, and next spring drive them back up and load them on the railroad cars and send them back to the stockyards at East St. Louis. That was I'd say in the late 1920s is the last time I can remember that. And he also bought a carload of cottonseed meal, which they fed to the cattle for a protein supplement. And it was packaged in 100-pound bags. And they were burlap bags, and if any of you know anything about cottonseed meal, it was pretty dusty. And some of it would filter through those bags, so that was a dusty job to unload those 100-pound bags of cottonseed meal and haul them down to the farm. And then they were used to feed the cattle during the wintertime. I remember when Hiram McCracken, This was probably about 1935. He bought a new thrashing machine and the first diesel tractor in the area. And they arrived in Reno by rail. And we went through town one Sunday morning going to church, and here were these two railroad cars sitting there with a brand new diesel tractor on one car and a new thrashing machine on the other car. They came into Reno by rail. My grandmother Weber's house is still standing north of the railroad tracks, straight north of the store building. We visited there quite often, and we especially liked the sugar pears from the tree in the front yard. And there was a 10-acre apple orchard out behind, and we went up there to get apples in the fall. The sugar pear tree and the apple orchard aren't there anymore, but the house is still there. Our wintertime recreation, when snow was on the ground, was coasting parties. We had contests to see whose sled would go the farthest. Our favorite hill was Hartley Hill. That was north from the Bethel Cemetery. Right north of Bethel Cemetery, you go down Corduroy Hill. And that's where Craig used to coast, on Corduroy Hill, when they got a little ice on the road. That was on the public road. And going up the other side after you cross Yankee Creek, that was Hartley Hill. And we didn't coast on the road, we coasted over in the field, but that's where most of our coasting was done. Then there were ice skating parties. There were two nice ponds at the Willis-Williford farm, and it was located east of Scott's Corner out on Route 127. We always called it Scott's Corner. It's a junction now between Route 127 and Sorrento Avenue. These ponds were shallow ponds, but they made good ice skating ponds. And if the ice broke through and we got wet, we didn't go over knee deep, so nobody was in any danger of drowning. The skates we had then were fastened to our shoes by using a skate key to tighten clamps, and then the addition of a strap on the top of the foot. The best time for skating was a moonlit night, and on those occasions my dad put a tarpaulin over the back of his truck, and he put a little straw inside. We all loaded up, and he drove through Reno, picked up anybody else that wanted to go ice skating, and hauled us to the pond. The addition of a nice bonfire made for a perfect evening. In the summertime, there were ice cream socials, which were held as fundraising projects for churches and other organizations. They served ice cream, cake, and soda pop. The young people played such games as Flying Dutchman, Three Deep, and Winkum if it wasn't too dark. In the area east of Route 127, there were several families who in the summertime hosted party game parties for the young people. And in addition to the games that I mentioned, they played singing party games such as Skip to Maloo and Pig in the Parlor. I got a new pig in the parlor, I got a new pig in the parlor, I got a new pig in the parlor, and he is Irish too. Then there were cemetery picnics, which were more sophisticated fundraising events sponsored by cemeteries. And there was a stage with local entertainment, usually a local band, and the lunch stand. And in addition to ice cream and soda pop, they served sandwiches and fried chicken dinners. There were also barn dances sponsored by local farmers. All that was needed for those barn dances was a good barn loft, a good fiddler, a square dance caller, and people who liked to dance. These people who are doing this recording don't know what the game Winkum was. That's a game we used to play, and this was for boys and girls, and there would be two circles, and the boy standing behind a girl. Each boy had a girl standing in front of him, except one, but he didn't have a partner. And he was to wink at whoever he wanted to come over and stand in front of him, and of course it couldn't be too dark or you couldn't play this game. And when he winked at a girl, the girl knew she was being winked at. She's supposed to try to get away from her partner and get over to this other fella before the fella behind her grabbed her and kept her from going. So that was the game Winkum.
Good grief.
Is that enough?
That's great. Okay, you can just go ahead and pick up where you left off. The education.
Okay.
Do a little introduction of it again.
Yeah. This next section of my life story I have titled Education. I received my early education.
Fred, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Do you like Roger Reedman a lot?
Do I like him a lot?
Because you're giving him a free television commercial there. The whole time
Oh.
that Bradford Bank is right in front.
I don't care.
That's what they call product placement in the Hollywood movies.
Start over.
Yeah, let's start over on